If any of you have done a React tutorial before this one, you might be curious why we're using functional components instead of a class-based component. When I'm teaching React, I prefer to start with functional components, simply because functions are really easy to understand and it's obvious what we're doing. We are simply creating a component with a function that returns the UI that we want to show up on the page. But as we go deeper and deeper into React and start learning about some new parts of React, we're going to find that a functional component can't do everything that we need it to do. And so at this point, what we're going to do is actually learn to create a class-based component. For now, our class-based component is going to do exactly what our functional component does. And then in upcoming lessons, we're going to talk about what class-based components can do for us, such as allowing us to implement state and lifecycle methods. But for now, let's just look at converting a functional component into a class-based component. If you're not really familiar yet with the class syntax in ES6, then I'd recommend going over to the Scrimba ES6 course and learning a little bit about classes. So instead of converting this functional component to a class component, I'm actually just going to create a new app class below it, and that way we can kind of compare the two. The class-based component will always start with the class keyword, and we're going to give it the same name of the component as we had before, app, except instead of parentheses and curly braces, we're going to extend React.component. And if you're not familiar with classes or what this is doing under the hood, essentially this is still using a prototype system in JavaScript, and it's setting up a prototype with React.component. All that really means is that we're getting a bunch of goodies from React.component that are pre-written for us, and we're going to get a chance to see that in upcoming lessons. For now, I'm just going to open this with a set of curly braces. And every class-based component at least needs one method, and that is the render method. And it actually needs to be spelled exactly this way. And then render will return exactly what we have in our functional component. And this class component is identical to the functional component we had above. So I should be able to comment this functional component out and save to watch the browser refresh. And we have exactly what we had before. Now let's take a look at our render method. Anytime we have any kind of display logic that's going to happen, I prefer to do it inside of my render method before the return. For example, you might remember a few videos back where we created a date object. And then we used that date to determine what time of the day it was, and we displayed in the text and used some styling and all sorts of stuff like that. If you have any code that determines the display logic, or in other words, what exactly is going to show up on the page or what the style of that element will be, things like that can go right here inside of the render method before you do the return. So this is a good place to set up your style objects if you're doing any inline styling, running the logic that will determine how something will get displayed on the screen, things like conditional rendering. All of that can happen here inside of the render method. Now, if you're familiar with classes, you technically could also take that and put it inside of a method of your own, a class method. To do that, above render, you would just enter your own method right here. Inside of this method, you could do any kind of display logic that you wish. And then from inside the render method, you can call your method by using this dot and then the name of your method. And if your method returns something, and this is where you would put that. A few lessons in the future, we're going to talk about some caveats with this. But for now, it's just as easy to put your display logic here inside of the render method. There's one other thing that we have to touch on before we're done with this, and that has to do with props. In our functional component, we could pass props to the function itself, and then inside of our code, we would just say props dot whatever the property was on the props object. There's only one small change we have to make with the class-based component, and that's that anytime we use props, we need to make sure that we are using this dot props. It's a pretty common thing to forget to do, especially when you're converting from a functional component to a class-based component, but it's also a bug that you'll get really good at catching and being able to fix right away. And before this becomes confusing, I realized I forgot my curly braces up here. And to be consistent, we will add a dot whatever here. As I mentioned at the beginning, class-based components enable us to do a lot of really cool new things with React, and we're going to be covering those over the next few lessons. But for now, let's get a chance to practice this. So take a second to play with this code, and once you're ready, let's move on to the practice in the next lesson.